Good evening, everybody. We're just going to give it 1 minute here while people join. Hope everybody's having a good evening. Certainly gorgeous out, so we can be happy about that. If you're just joining, we're going to start here at 7:01. Seeing people file in. That's good. People are still coming in. Okay, 7:01 on my clock. So good evening, everybody. My name is Matt Ross. I'm the Director of Conservation for the National Deer Association. We're in for a good evening. This is night 6 of a 6-part regional presentation across the state about chronic wasting disease. Certainly not a fun topic, but critically important, especially if you care about deer. And I'm guessing if you're taking some time out of your busy schedule to join us for some presentations and Q&A at the end, you care about deer. So let me tell you who we have on our panel. We have Justin Vreeland, who is the Southcentral Region Wildlife Management Supervisor with the Pennsylvania Game Commission. He'll be first up, and Justin's going to talk about chronic wasting disease in the Southcentral region. Next up, we have Brian Richards, the Emerging Disease Coordinator, also a deer biologist, or a biologist with National Wildlife Health Center with USGS out of Madison, Wisconsin. Third up, we have Kip Adams, the Chief Conservation Officer with the National Deer Association. Brian's going to give a national perspective on chronic wasting disease, and Kip is going to be giving a hunter's perspective on chronic wasting disease. And then finally, we have Andrea Corman, the CWD Coordinator with Pennsylvania Game Commission, to round it up. And she will give us a perspective of what the Pennsylvania Game Commission is doing about chronic wasting disease in the state. At the end of those presentations, we'll have a Q&A session where all 4 of those panelists, plus Eric Gagne. Eric is also part of our panel tonight. He's an assistant professor of wildlife disease ecology with Wildlife Futures, which is a partnership between PGC and Penn Vet. I will moderate tonight. If you have any questions that come up during the presentation, please add those to the Q&A feature. You'll find that at the very bottom. And we'll monitor those. You can ask them as they come up, and at the end we'll go through each one as long as we have time and address those. And I will either address the entire panel or a specific speaker. If you have a question for a specific speaker, please make a note of that. Tonight's session is being recorded, and I'll announce at the end where you may find that. So if you missed something and you'd like to hear it again or go back and listen to one or more presentations, I'll mention where that will be. So sit back, relax, and I hope you enjoy the evening. And first up, again, we have Justin Vreeland, who is the Southcentral Region Wildlife Management Supervisor with PGC. So Justin, floor is yours. Go ahead and share your screen, and I'll let you know if we can hear you.
Okay, thank you, Matt. Everything coming up well?
Looks great from my end.
Okay.
Floor is
yours.
Well,
thanks for the opportunity to speak, and thanks everyone in the audience for taking time out of your evening to learn about chronic wasting disease today. In my opinion, this is the most significant threat to white-tailed deer populations in North America since modern scientific wildlife management began over 100 years ago. And this issue is not just professional for me, but it's personal. I'm a deer hunter. I enjoy cooking and consuming venison. So this is important to me as well as many of you in the audience. So my primary focus tonight is to give you an update on our monitoring efforts in the Southcentral region, but I'm going to start with a real whirlwind refresher about CWD. So this is one of a family of neurologic diseases that affect the deer family. In Pennsylvania, that means it affects our white-tailed deer and has the potential to affect our elk herd. It's caused by an abnormal protein called a prion, and is not a living organism like a virus or a bacteria. And partly for that reason, there's no current treatment. There's no vaccine, no cure that can help manage this disease in individuals or populations. And for that reason, it's always fatal if it's contracted. It's really important to know that looks can be deceiving. It takes a long time for a deer to look sick once it's become infected. In fact, 18 to 24 months might pass before an animal starts looking unhealthy. So this dandy of a buck you see here on the left might in fact be positive for chronic wasting disease, whereas this severely emaciated, wasted animal on the right may be suffering from something else and not test positive for CWD. In fact, I'm jumping ahead here, but a few years ago when we had fewer positives annually than we do now, our game wardens would interview every hunter that harvested a deer that later turned out to be positive. And over 90% of those hunters reported that the deer they harvested looked healthy and acted normal. CWD is spread from deer to deer contact when they're engaging in social behaviors, but it's also spread through environmental contamination. Those prions are shed into the environment through feces and saliva and decomposing tissue. And when an uninfected animal ingests some soil or some plant material, it then becomes infected. And what makes this disease really, really difficult to manage is those prions persist in the soil for up to 16 years, which is way longer than most wild deer will ever survive. So I'll be talking exclusively about the Game Commission's Disease Management Area 2, which is this polygon shaded in green, but specifically about the 12 counties that comprise the South Central region of the Game Commission. And right now, Disease Management Area 2 is about 7,000 square miles, and the South Central region also is about 7,000 square miles, 80% of which is covered by DMA2, so almost 6,000 square miles is affected here in the region. For those who weren't aware, the South Central region was the first place CWD was detected in Pennsylvania. So in October of 2012, a captive deer facility here in Adams County found some positive deer. And then later that same year from rifle deer season, we had 3 wild positives detected in Blair and Bedford counties. So we've been dealing with this disease for now our 10th year here in the South Central region. And we've been dealing it by monitoring very aggressively since we became positive and even before that. So a number of ways we surveil for this disease is by sampling deer, and our primary and largest sample is from deer harvested by hunters. We make available on the landscape in our disease management areas these drop bins like you see on the left, in which hunters voluntarily place their heads. We also send a large contingent of staff out to butchers and processors statewide. So this is not just in our disease management areas, but throughout the state, to collect a random sample of deer harvested by hunters. Our third sample comes from roadkill. So when we establish a new disease management area, we begin sampling roadkill throughout the year. This is important because it gives us a more random sample of the population. It enables us to get a sample outside of hunting season, so from animals that might have died before a hunter harvests the deer. And it also gives us a sample from areas where deer harvest densities are not very high. And our last sample is small, but a very important one. And this comes from clinical suspects. Deer that look sick probably are sick. In fact, every picture you see here on the slide was taken by one of our wardens in Bedford County. Each of these deer was reported to us by a member of the public saying, hey, I've got a sick deer. And this warden visited the property, euthanized these deer, and every single one of them turned out to be positive. And in fact, the number of suspects that test positive is significantly higher in terms of a rate than those from hunter harvester roadkills. So we started sampling statewide in the late 1990s. We've sampled well over 100,000 deer statewide. But as we began sampling more aggressively in disease management area 2, those numbers have increased even more at a higher density. So this is a snapshot of just the last 11 months of sampling starting in July of 2020, just in the South Central region. We've sampled almost 6,000 deer already. And you can see our greatest sample comes from those hunter harvests, with the vast majority coming from the voluntary drop bins. We also sample a significant number of roadkill and a handful of those suspects. So we're sampling about 1 deer for every square mile on average throughout disease management area 2. Later this evening, Andrea is going to give you an excellent presentation on the progression of CWD in Pennsylvania and inside disease management area 2. But I wanted to give you a pretty dramatic snapshot of what's happened here since 2012 and just in the last couple of years. So remember, I mentioned in 2012, we had 3 wild positives. That was out of a sample of just a few hundred from the immediate counties surrounding Blair and Bedford counties. Now, in last hunting season, the one that started in 2019 and ended in 2020, we collected 8,000 samples just in the South Central region alone, and fewer than 200 of them were positive. Now, just this last year, again, we sampled about 6,000 deer, but we've already detected 230 deer positive with chronic wasting disease. So we've sampled fewer deer and we have more positives. This is a clear indication that this infection is growing, more intense, and it's also expanding. As a result of new positives at the leading edge of our DMA, hunters can expect some changes for the upcoming hunting seasons. A roadkill buck from November of 2020, just outside Bald Eagle, northeast of Tyrone in Blair County, and a newly positive captive deer facility in northern Blair County have caused us to propose an expansion of DMA2 up into farther into Center County, and it's now going to include all of Blair County and a larger portion of Huntington County. Now, this expansion over here is entirely east of the Susquehanna River. That is caused by an increase in positives primarily in eastern Snyder and eastern Juniata counties. So this doesn't directly affect the South Central region, but if you hunt in this area or adjacent to this area, depending on where you take your deer for processing, this may affect your hunting plans. Last year, we had 44 head drop bins available for hunters from early archery in October through late archery and flintlock season in January. This year, we anticipate having all 44 of those again on the landscape, and we're going to be adding 2 new bins, one in eastern Snyder, one in eastern Perry County, to accommodate the expansion east of the Susquehanna. And the last thing I'll mention is another program administered by the Game Commission called the Deer Management Assistance Program. This is primarily for landowners to help control crop damage and forest regeneration problems on their property. But the Game Commission also enrolls large areas in which hunters have available to them additional permits to harvest antlerless deer during the hunting seasons. And these are formed around areas where there's small but growing hotspots and positives. And we have 5 of these units in DMA2, 3 of which are wholly or almost entirely within the South Central region. And we anticipate having these again for this year. So with that, I will turn it back over to Matt. If I can figure out how to stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much, Justin.
There you go.
Great presentation and a good overview of what's going on in the South Central region. Next up, we have Brian Richards, the Emerging Disease Coordinator, not a deer biologist, an Emerging Disease Coordinator with the National Wildlife Health Center. And Brian's going to give a national perspective of chronic wasting disease. Brian, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you. I'm assuming you can hear me and you can see a background there, right?
I can, you're good.
All right, we will roll with the slides then. All righty, well, thanks, and good evening again. My name is Brian Richards, and I am a deer biologist, I guess. I've studied deer pretty much my entire life and spent far too much time in college and graduate school studying deer. So wildlife biologist at the U.S. Geological Survey's National Wildlife Health Center, Madison, Wisconsin. Our Science Center, which is pictured here, we conduct diagnostics and wildlife disease research, and we provide epidemiological and technical assistance to state, tribal, and federal partners. We're the only federal facility with a total focus on wildlife health, and that's solely for the benefit of wildlife. We're recognized by the World Organization for Animal Health as a collaborating center for wildlife health and biodiversity, and by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations as a reference center for wildlife health and wildlife disease diagnostics. We've been around since 1975. And we've been involved with a number of very important and high-profile wildlife disease issues since that time. Started out in the early days with things like lead poisoning, all the way through West Nile virus, white nose syndrome, highly pathogenic avian influenza. More recently, things like rabbit hemorrhagic disease and SARS coronavirus 2 in wildlife. Been involved with chronic wasting disease since 2002, and that was actually the day after it was first detected or the test came back as positive in the state of Wisconsin. I personally have been at the center since 2004, and I spent 11 years with Texas Parks and Wildlife Department prior to that. So this evening, I'll be giving a short primer and an update on CWD in North America. But before I start, I would like to take a moment to thank the sponsors, National Deer Association, the Pennsylvania Game Commission, and the Penn Wildlife Futures Program for sponsoring this event. And I'd like to thank you, the audience, for taking the time and effort to attend. I'll also note that Justin did a fantastic job of kind of setting this up for me. And so some of the things I'll be telling you will be a little bit redundant based on what Justin covered, with the emphasis that disease is a pretty significant issue in the south central portion of Pennsylvania. So I'm going to start out tonight with a newspaper article. I guess it was from about a month ago now, published in Penn Live, written by Marcus Schneck. And some of the points made in that article: deer killed by hunters in last hunting season in the hot zone for CWD found to be infected at a rate of 14%, up from 8% the previous hunting license year. Had a total of 218 positives, again, out of about 12,000 or a little over 12,000 whitetails tested for CWD. And that number of 218 was described by Matthew Schnupp, the director of the Bureau of Wildlife Management, as it was literally a punch in the stomach for wildlife managers and hunters. I couldn't agree more. Commissioner Timothy Layton stated that the only hope for making things better in the established area and for keeping CWD at bay elsewhere in the state is for hunters to help wildlife managers. And the author then reiterated that hunter resistance to deer reduction efforts can be a stumbling block to efforts to battle the disease. So again, just to summarize, CWD, it's pretty clear, has a very good foothold in Pennsylvania, and it's likely getting worse. Management efforts don't seem to be working that well. And clearly, if hunters don't support and actively engage in management, that's not likely to change. In fact, CWD will likely continue to grow and spread to other areas of the state. So that's not designed to be a scare tactic. It's reality. We've experienced this over and over again in other states and provinces. And I can pretty clearly articulate to you the road you seem to be heading down right now will likely lead to a lot more of those punches to the stomach. So let's start with a few observations about CWD. What's it doing out there? Well, number one, it's already been indicated, it's spreading geographically, both nationally and in Pennsylvania. Number two, prevalence, where the proportion of the population affected with CWD is growing in many locations, including in your core zone. CWD kills deer directly, but what may be more important is that CWD results in progressive neurological degeneration, thus predisposing deer to other sources of mortality, like getting hit by a car, an arrow, or a bullet. So whatever the ultimate cause, deer with CWD tend to die much sooner than they would have otherwise. Some of the consequences of CWD. First, it's very expensive. Every facet of CWD costs real dollars to natural resource agencies, including the Game Commission. On top of that, CWD has tended to erode stakeholder trust in their management agencies. And in the longer term, there can be other pretty substantial impacts on deer themselves. Deer populations tend to suffer over the long run. Initially, you might start to witness a decline in harvestable surplus, and that's the segment of population you hunt every year. And in a few areas with very high prevalence, CWD has actually driven population decline. Demographic shifts towards younger aged animals are also likely to occur. So if your goal is to produce or harvest older aged animals, those often managed for and desired by hunters, you're likely not to be able to sustain that goal. Finally, hunter behavior is also predicted to change. So if you hunt in an area with high prevalence, maybe in that 30 to 40 to 50% range, either you or a family member will alter your hunting behavior and either choose to hunt elsewhere or stop deer hunting altogether. And that has the potential to circle back to the ability of the Game Commission to manage not only deer, but all the other resources that rely on hunting license dollars. So here's kind of that stock, photo of a deer, and with the question mark, does this deer have CWD? Well, maybe, maybe not. I cannot tell you whether this deer has CWD or not. Nobody can merely by looking at it. A deer with CWD looks and acts perfectly normal for many, many months before it starts to develop that classical wasting appearance. But if this deer does have CWD, she's actively shedding infectious agent into the environment, and she's capable of directly infecting other deer, but she looks just fine. So this is one of the issues that natural resource managers have over and over, have to deal with CWD. Most hunters, even in hard-hit areas, have never seen a deer in the clinical phase of CWD. So it's hard to fathom that this silent killer is really out there, but it is. So this slide lists some of the characteristics of CWD. CWD is a transmissible spongiform encephalopathy in the same category diseases that include Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease in humans and bovine spongiform encephalopathy in cattle. Hallmarks of all TSEs include a long incubation period, progressive neurological degeneration, a relatively brief clinical phase, followed by death. CWD and its cousin scrapie in sheep are unique among TSEs in that diseased animals shed infectious agent via bodily fluids like saliva, urine, and feces, and can directly infect their other herd or flock members. Deer become infected by ingesting or inhaling that infectious agent. Transmission can be via direct contact or indirect with a contaminated environmental fomite. Vertical or doe to fawn transmission prior to birth has been documented and plays an unknown role in nature. The incubation period is protracted, followed by a brief clinical phase. Infected animals shed infectious agent long before the onset of clinical disease, and shed prions can persist in the environment for years, likely decades, and serve as a reservoir of infectivity for other animals. We tend to see higher infection rates in males and in older age classes of each sex. We can test for disease in live deer, but it's very challenging. So the majority of surveillance samples are collected from hunter-killed animals. At this time, management tools are pretty limited, and there's little evidence of widespread genetic resistance. So the combination of these characteristics makes CWD extremely challenging to manage in free-ranging populations. So what does CWD do to that individual deer? Well, CWD is a death sentence for every deer that gets it. If disease runs its full course, it's likely a couple of years on average. But due to progressive neurological degeneration, recall most CWD positive deer die of some other factor, and they die even sooner. Well, that's the very basics of what CWD is and what it does to deer. But there's a big question. Why care? There's a lot of deer out there, right? So in 2016, Drs. John Fisher and Mike Miller presented a paper at the North American Natural Resources Conference, wherein they described the first 50 years of our experience with CWD. In that paper, they posed two overarching reasons why we might be concerned about CWD. First, that CWD in the long term is very hard on deer populations. The second is that we cannot rule out that CWD could someday become a human health issue. So that remains an open question, but not consuming venison from CWD positive deer is what human health experts recommend. So now I'm going to take a few moments and go through some of the data, science regarding what CWD might be doing at the population level to cervids, or members of the deer family. So start out with the current documented distribution of CWD in North America. It's now been detected in 26 states, 3 Canadian provinces in free-ranging and/or commercial captive facilities. On the captive side, CWD has been detected in approximately 150 facilities in the United States and 128 in Canada. On this map, the polygons represent CWD in wild deer, elk, and moose. The dots represent captive deer operations where the disease has been detected. CWD has also been documented in South Korea, Norway, Finland, and Sweden. Clearly, pretty substantial footprint here in North America, both in wild and captive deer. So let's back up in time a little bit, back to 2005. This was 3 years after CWD was detected initially in the state of Wisconsin, and right after it was picked up in New York and West Virginia. That map looks quite a bit different than it does today. And here's early 2013, right after Pennsylvania had announced their initial detections in wild deer. A single captive deer farm had been detected in Pennsylvania at that time. Now I'm flashing back to the current time. Pennsylvania, the rest of North America, looks quite a bit different than it did a mere 8 years ago. Now I'm going to hone in on your region a little bit. This is right after your initial detection back in 2012. The disease had already been documented in West Virginia, Maryland, and in a single county in Virginia, plus that initial captive facility over in Adams County. Now back to the current time. CWD has been detected in wild deer in 14 counties now in Pennsylvania and more to the south as well. It's also been confirmed in 28 captive deer facilities in Pennsylvania. It's important to note that this map includes an entire county, even if there's only a single wild positive in that county. That's the level of data that I personally have access to, and at the national mapping level, that works just fine. But when I zoom into smaller areas like this, it does tend to exaggerate the area where CWD has been confirmed. That being said, the way this disease tends to spread, it may not be an exaggeration for long. Here's a case in point. Virginia just announced a detection in Montgomery County in a 2.5-year-old buck taken by a hunter last November. This was 160 miles from their closest existing case. And Ohio documented their first wild positives in the state in Wyandotte County in 2 deer taken this past season. Now I'm going to show you some data from my home state of Wisconsin. The red squares are 1-mile sections where CWD has been confirmed in 1 or more hunter-killed deer. The disease was first confirmed in Wisconsin in 2002, and the State Department of Natural Resources conducted a massive amount of surveillance in the next few years. Over 40,000 samples in 2002 alone. And those are primarily hunter-killed deer. So this map is a pretty good approximation of where CWD was in 2005. Now up to the current time. CWD was picked up in 1,578 deer in Wisconsin last year alone, out of just under 19,000 samples. In comparison, remember you had 218 positives out of about 12,000 samples. So CWD has now been documented in 32 of 72 counties in Wisconsin in wild deer, in something over 8,000 individual positive wild deer. So sampling in the state is voluntary. So what it's been documented in is a clear subset of the actual number killed by hunters and what exists today in the wild. Plus, we have 29 captive facilities where CWD has been detected. So I'd argue, based on just that little bit of information we've shown now, that there's been a dramatic expansion in CWD's footprint nationally, in my home state of Wisconsin, also in Pennsylvania and elsewhere. But what about prevalence? Is disease increasing as well as spreading? So here's some data again from Wisconsin. The 3 red dots are areas where CWD is performing very well out on the landscape. Now I'm going to zoom in on one of those prevalence charts. Curves represent the proportion of deer that tested positive and how that increased over time. You can see in this zone, CWD was essentially non-existent back in 2002 and for the next several years. Then it really started to take off. Today, if you shoot a mature buck in this zone, it's literally 50-50 odds that that deer has CWD. 1 in 3 odds in adult does and yearling bucks, and 1 in 5 in yearling does. So here's an image from the Game Commission website showing testing results. I believe this shows results for all samples collected last year, so the reported percent positive looks pretty small, less than 2%. But look at the rate of growth in the bar chart on the lower right. The rate of detecting positives in your state is increasing quite rapidly. This time I selected adult males and just hunter-killed deer. And so I believe this is just the CWD DMUs in the state, but now you're up to almost 5% prevalence. And we'd expect that, as adult males are more likely to be positive than other herd segments. But look at that growth trend in the lower right. I sketched an exponential growth curve over the top of the chart, and the fit, at least visually, is fairly good. So unfortunately, I'd argue that CWD appears to be performing in your core area in a fashion very similar to that in Wisconsin, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and the list would go on. The question is, why wouldn't it? What is Pennsylvania doing today? What are you willing to do tomorrow to alter that trend and outcomes? Earlier, I mentioned one of the potential long-term outcomes is hunters changing their behavior in CWD zones. So this is a good friend of mine here in Wisconsin, is very active in both the CWD world and in social media. And he started soliciting what he refers to as CWD stories from some of his contributors. Here's one from the very core of our CWD positive area in Wisconsin. So in 2014, a group of 4 hunting buddies leased 280 acres in Iowa County, and that's right in the core of CWD here in Wisconsin. Over the course of 4 years, every single buck they killed was positive. Over a dozen CWD positive deer in 4 years. It became so bad that they gave up the lease and checked out. They could not stand shooting the deer and not being able to eat them. So I think that's pretty sobering. I can't imagine wanting to hunt in a place like that myself. And, you know, to be honest, it's likely where some of your core area is headed in the future. So what can be done about CWD? And what's the Commonwealth willing to do about it? And remember that statement coming from Commissioner Layton about needing hunter support? So I have to insert a caveat here when discussing management options. Pennsylvania is not my home state. I have no management prerogative or authority in your state or anywhere else for that matter. I cannot tell you what to do. That's ultimately your choice and not mine. But there are some opportunities. I refer to CWD management as kind of a two-part story. First, if you don't have CWD, you might want to consider doing everything you can to keep it that way. And you have some control here. First, identifying all the possible ways that CWD could come to you, and people are involved in most of them, then implementing regulatory measures to stop or slow those processes. But regulations on their own are likely not enough. Providing information and education to stakeholders is very necessary, as a well-informed populace is more likely to make better choices and reduce risk. So another caveat, if you're really close, and some in this zone are really close to where CWD is in the wild, those precautionary measures are going to be less effective. You might be able to get humans to stop moving CWD, but deer will continue to move it themselves, and that's harder to address. So part 2 of the story. If you have CWD, do something about it, but do it in measurable and meaningful ways that can actually alter outcomes. So as an example, Pennsylvania, a lot of other jurisdictions as well, are doing a ton of disease surveillance right now, and that's great. Learning about how CWD is performing in the wild is an excellent idea, but surveillance itself is not active disease management. Surveillance is watching, but it does not alter disease outcomes. So earlier on, I mentioned that the CWD toolbox doesn't have a lot of great tools in it. Well, what would a really good full toolbox look like? For CWD, here's some of the tools I think would be useful. Maybe someday we'll have them, but we don't today, and it's likely a while before we will. First, there's ongoing research into vaccines. But again, we're likely many years away. And even if we did have a vaccine, we have a pretty significant logistical hurdle trying to deliver it to millions of deer across such a large swath of North America. There's also ongoing work dealing with genetic resistance. But again, to date, there's no genotype that is truly resistant to CWD. They all seem to get the disease, just some live longer with that disease than others. And once again, even if we can produce, a genetic, fully resistant genotype, how can we produce enough of these to alter genetic composition at the population level in the wild? Disinfectants, both for use with vehicles, tools, surfaces, and to mitigate environmental contamination in the wild. That would be a really strong tool. And if we could somehow identify whether a deer has CWD remotely, then selectively remove only positives from the population, we could really start to alter outcomes then. But don't hold your breath on that one. But what about better tests, especially ones where we can determine whether CWD is or is not in an area without ever testing a single deer? Science is making progress on that one. But again, just knowing where disease is does not alter outcomes. It's still watching, but with better tools. Again, we don't have these tools today, but I'd argue it makes a lot of sense to try and do what we can to address CWD now, and it will be simpler to use these tools if and when they are developed. So what do we have for tools today? Essentially, we have the same ones we've had for a very long time. Lethal removal of animals from affected populations. That works both inside fences and in the wild. There's different ways, clearly, to use this tool depending on your situation and goals. I won't go into too many details here, but this tool is the one that does hold promise if wielded in an aggressive, sustained, and targeted manner. The last 2 points I think are really important as well. Are there any impediments to removing deer in Pennsylvania today? Are there seasons, bag limits, restrictions on any group or cohort of deer that prevent willing hunters and landowners from taking this task on? And are there any mechanisms that the Commonwealth could adopt that might compel reluctant stakeholders to participate? Experience suggests that you're going to have to think outside the box to be successful with this disease. But there's some good news, at least. You don't have to start from scratch. Here's 2 resources I highly recommend. AFWA, or the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, recently published a set of best management practices, and the Western states and provinces, who've been dealing with CWD longer than anyone, recently published a set of adaptive management guidelines. These are available online, they're free, and I would encourage anyone interested in CWD to take a look at them. So here's the core best management practices for actively dealing with CWD in the wild. They make sense and represent what science and experience offer. First, targeting deer most likely to have CWD, and remember that begins with the adult males. Next, targeting animals in CWD hotspots, kind of like putting out a campfire before it shoots sparks out and lights the forest on fire. Next, adjust season timing. Do you have open season, open hunting in the peak of the rut? Do you allow the most efficient weapons to be used during the rut? And are there time limits or any limits on the number and kind of deer that hunters can take? Next, reducing density in CWD zones. The lower the population, the fewer the number of positives. Lowering density likely will not reduce prevalence, at least in the short run, but it will reduce that standing crop of positives on the landscape. And from a disease perspective, that's a really good thing. Eliminating practices that congregate deer, baiting, feeding, lures, both natural and artificial, all are designed to attract deer to a specific place and time, and all enhance the risk of deer-to-deer transmission. So we have tools that can be employed, but when we look at the maps, the prevalence curves, the literature, it doesn't seem like they're having that much success. Well, why is that? So that's a photo of Aldo Leopold, and he's recognized as the father of wildlife management, was a really prolific writer. So Leopold identified that wildlife management, he called it a 3-legged stool, and you have to have all 3 legs to be successful. And even in 1943, he recognized that people management was the hardest of the 3 legs. And CWD is a prime example of this. So Dr. Jordan Pachenik is a retired social scientist from the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, a human dimensions specialist. And these next few slides are from a talk he gave shortly before he retired and are based on over 15 years of working with stakeholders on CWD in the state of Wisconsin. So in Wisconsin and elsewhere, including Pennsylvania, when the disease is initially detected, there's a lot of support for actively addressing CWD. In the Game Commission, it's their mission to provide healthy wildlife. Landowners generally don't want CWD, and hunters generally support even some measures to harvest more deer. But there's a caveat with this support. These stakeholders have to be convinced that their individual efforts will make a difference. And even if there's strong support initially, that support tends to wane over time. But why is that? Turns out there's a host of what Jordan referred to as restraining forces that push back against the will to support active CWD management. And eventually they overwhelm. Things like sharpshooting, bounties for deer are simply not popular. Evidence. Remember how few hunters have actually seen a CWD positive deer in clinical phase. Hunter ethic. Many hunt for sport and tradition, and asking hunters to be disease managers is very challenging. And even if hunters are willing, they have a consumption limit, and they're unlikely to harvest a lot of extra deer if they cannot use them. Many are not in favor of the type of population reduction that might be necessary to alter outcomes. Doubt, this creeps in over time, and there's a lot of alternative theories floating around on the internet and social media that help fuel doubt. And what about risk? Many believe there's little to no risk with CWD to either deer or humans. So we begin with that attitudinal support. Nobody wants CWD, but what we lack is behavioral support. Attitudinal support has failed to translate into sustained behavioral support for actively and aggressively managing CWD in many places over and over again. So what are the issues we have, at hand with this disease? Well, keeping CWD from moving further across your state and North America, then managing the disease where it is today, again, in ways that can alter outcomes. Managing CWD in the commercial captive cervid industry, identifying those risk factors, pathways for disease movement, and managing those factors. Misinformation. Again, we live in a society where misinformation can thrive and move very rapidly and end up influencing a lot of stakeholders. And if stakeholders do not support the Game Commission, actively support the Game Commission, these trends you are already documenting are very likely to continue. So I'm going to finish up kind of right back where we started and reiterate the data to date don't look very promising, but I still think you can turn it around. CWD can be managed, but it will not be simple. Outcomes can be altered, but it won't be quick. CWD management is not some sort of an a la carte menu where you can act as a small handful of simple measures and hope to alter outcomes. It simply doesn't work that way. Commissioner Layton really nailed it. The only hope for making things better is for hunters to help wildlife managers. So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you this evening. And I believe we'll take questions later on this evening after other speakers. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Matt. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Excellent job. And he's correct. If you have any questions for Brian or any of the other speakers, please type them into the Q&A and we'll address those all at the end. Next up, we have Kip Adams, the Chief Conservation Officer for the National Deer Association. And Kip will be talking about the hunter perspective of chronic wasting disease. So Kip, go ahead and share your screen.
All right, thank you, Matt. I appreciate that. And great job to Justin and Brian so far tonight. And welcome everybody. And my part of this is to really relate this to hunters and what this means to us as hunters. And I'll say this, I'm very proud to be a Pennsylvania native. I live in the north central part of the state. I've been a wildlife biologist for over 25 years. But I will say this, I am first and foremost a deer hunter. So I like to chase them in the fall with my family, friends. I like to study them throughout the year. And so this is near and dear to my heart because I fully agree with Justin. This is by far the biggest threat to the future of hunting, to the future of our deer herds and deer herd health. So I'm glad we had the opportunity to talk to folks tonight about this. And my take on this is I'm going to share the science and show this from a hunting perspective exactly what this means to us. But to do that, though, we need to really understand first about the importance of deer. We know very clearly that about 79% of American hunters pursue deer, and that means that there's somewhere around 11 million deer hunters out there. Just for a little bit of comparison here, there's only about 3 million turkey hunters, and turkeys are the second most hunted species that we have in the United States. There's only about 1.5 million duck hunters, and there's less than 1 million elk hunters. I love to chase elk, ducks, and turkeys as well, but I show you these to show that deer hunter numbers dwarf the system. There are so many more deer hunters than any other hunter segment, which provides tremendous opportunity for what we can do to help battle this disease. because of the sheer numbers that we have, deer drive the hunting industry. They're the most sought after game species in North America, and deer hunters contribute about 60% of the entire $37 billion that's generated from hunting. This is license fees, this is excise taxes on the gear that we use, and everything else that goes into this. So this is big money. This is really big money. Right here in the Keystone State, hunting contributes over $1.5 billion annually to our economy. So we're talking about big dollars that go into this. You may be thinking, well, why does that matter? Well, it matters because much of our wildlife management programs are funded through hunting. They're funded through excise taxes on this gear, through license fees, and the fact that deer hunters outnumber all the other hunting segments by so far just shows that deer drive this industry, and much of what we have today comes off the backs of deer hunters. Now, you may not be a deer hunter, but even if you're a deer enthusiast, I'm hoping that you want to have healthy deer herds, but maybe you're more interested in some other game species, or maybe a non-game species, maybe songbirds is your thing. It's important to realize that deer help fund management for all of those other species. So whether you're a deer hunter or not, the fact that we have healthy deer is extremely important to all of our wildlife species and our wildlife management programs. Well, we talk a lot about hunters when we talk about CWD, and that's because a lot of the things that it impacts are things we like to chase around. CWD has been confirmed in mule deer, elk, black-tailed deer, whitetails, moose, and reindeer. Obviously, we can hunt all of these. Are there others? There may be. There may be other cervids we just haven't identified yet. But just from the ones that we do know, it's stuff that we love to hunt, and it's stuff that contributes greatly to our wildlife management programs. And that's why this is by far one of the biggest threats, not just to whitetails, but to all of our wildlife management programs that we're dealing with today. I'm going to give you a quick update here on some CWD information. Justin and Brian did a great job with this, but straight from a hunter's perspective. Even if you don't get into all of the other science part of this, all you need to know is that CWD has no vaccine, no cure, and it is 100% fatal to all the whitetails. So from a deer hunter's perspective, this clearly is not a good situation. Dealing specifically with white-tailed deer, we know that the probability of infection increases with age in both bucks and does, and adult bucks are more likely to be infected than does, about twice as likely. So what does this mean to us as hunters? Well, it means that if we want to have healthy deer in the future, we need to reduce the age structure of both bucks and does. We'll talk a little more about this once we get going, but the things that the Game Commission puts into place relative to what we're allowed to harvest and how many we can harvest is a direct result of what we're seeing here. As deer get older, they're more likely to have it. And it's certainly true for the buck side. Now, that doesn't mean we can forget about the does. We can't do that. Adult bucks are about twice as likely as adult does to have it. However, in just about every segment of the country that whitetails exist, there are more than 2 adult does for every adult buck on the landscape. So we can't just go about this from the buck side. We need to go about this from the buck side and the antlerless side as well, if we have a chance to beat this disease. This deer here is one of the first 3 wild deer that were confirmed with CWD east of the Mississippi River. This is one that was shot in the fall of 2001 in Wisconsin. And I show you this specifically because look how thin this deer is. This deer is definitely starting to show some signs of being sick. However, as we've heard earlier, this is rarely the case. Deer can have this for 18 to 24 months, look perfectly normal. However, once they do start going downhill, they go downhill pretty rapidly. So when those symptoms actually start. However, we know a lot more about this today than we did back in 2001 or 2002. For instance, research shows us today that if a deer has the disease, it is 2 to 3 more times more likely to die this year than a deer that doesn't. But what happens is it's just more predisposed to being killed by a bullet, a Buick, predator, or something else first before you ever see these signs. That's why some hunters will say, why don't I see dead deer laying everywhere if this is such a big deal? Well, the reality of it is they die of something else first. And some hunters will say, well, if they're going to die to something else, is it really that big of a deal? And the answer is yes, it absolutely is. Think about something else that you may like to hunt or just watch. Squirrels, turkeys, songbirds, whatever. If there was a segment of that population that was 2 to 3 times more likely to die this year than another segment of it, that's obviously a big concern. And that's exactly what we're seeing with deer here. Also, research shows that deer with CWD are less active than other deer. So think about this from a hunting perspective. How many times have you gone hunting and said, man, I hope deer are not moving today. I hope there is no activity at all. We have never said that as hunters. We want deer on their feet. We want them to be moving. Deer with CWD don't move as much as deer that don't have it. So that as well is not a good situation for us from a hunting end. But back to this picture here. So this deer is wasting away a little bit. We can see it's pretty thin. However, take a look at its antlers. This has a good set of antlers on this. So what this means is that this deer was very healthy, or at least appeared healthy, during the antler growing part of this year. So it was harvested in firearm season at the end of the year, but somewhere between April and August, this deer was still doing pretty good to be able to grow a set of antlers like this. What this also means is that this hunter right here would have looked very, very different and likely would not have shown any of these symptoms that we've seen here. So the only way to have known that this deer had the disease would have been to have it tested. So this is actually a very unique deer that we get to see, that a hunter saw, that has showing symptoms starting to waste away. All right, let's talk about what we can do from a hunting perspective to help battle this disease. Well, the ways that we know for sure is that movement of infected captive deer. There's deer that are moved legally among farms on a very regular basis. And I'll show you here, this is a map from Pennsylvania. These are all the legal recorded movements of deer among or between captive facilities in the state over a 10-year period. And as you can see, this is a lot of movement. The problem comes in with this is that we don't have a reliable, practical live animal test. We're getting closer, and we have some tests that work a little bit, but we don't have something that's surefire. So what that means is deer are inadvertently moved with the disease. And this is not a bash on deer farmers. They don't want to be moving deer either. There's deer recently right here in Texas where a Uvalde County farm moved deer into a couple other Texas counties. This was just confirmed within, or just released anyway, within the last week. So it has now infected 2 more counties there in Texas, other facilities. We've moved deer out of Pennsylvania to counties or facilities in Ohio and infected them. So we don't want to do that. The reason that this is a problem is because there is not a good test for us to know for sure while the animal is live if it has it or not. So we inadvertently then move them between facilities and then infect new areas. Well, it's not just from the captive side, and I'll say this, CWD is not a captive deer disease. It's not just a wild deer disease. It is a disease of deer, and we need to work together to help solve this. But we also know that the disease is moved by immigration of an infected wild deer. Research in Pennsylvania and elsewhere show that 50 to 75% of all of our yearling bucks are going to disperse between 12 and 18 months of age, and they're going to go 1 to 5 miles from where they were born. If one of those deer has this disease, he's going to take it with him. Does disperse at a much lower rate, but some does are dispersing as well. So, and they can take the disease with them too. And we know that this is one route that the disease finds its way into a new area. However, a likely bigger way, and certainly something that from a hunting end we can help with, we know the deer can contract this when they come into contact with remains of an infected deer. So where this comes in here is by the high-risk parts of deer that we harvest. The high-risk parts are the eyes, the brain, the spleen, the backbone. So what this means is if you harvest a deer that has CWD, take those high-risk parts and discard them out in the landscape somewhere else, and a deer comes in contact with them, it can contract the disease. So what this means, this is why the Game Commission does not allow us to take these high-risk parts out of the disease zones, because they don't want us to move that elsewhere. This is also why many states out there today do not allow you to bring these high-risk parts of the harvested deer into their state, regardless if it's coming from a place that had CWD or not. That's a good measure. That's a good thing. And I expect someday we're probably going to have borders closed all across the whitetails range and not be allowed to move these high-risk parts. So from a hunting end, we can leave these high-risk parts either at the kill site or in the county where we got them or within that zone, not move them elsewhere, can take them to a landfill. There's a lot of things that we can do here to help limit the spread of this disease, and every single hunter can do this. And tell your buddies, make sure that they understand what they can do. So this is a great way that we can help limit that spread by not moving these high-risk parts out of that disease zone. All right, well, let's talk about some of the impacts that the disease has on other hunters in society. One, and the hunters don't like to hear talk about this, but the disease gets confirmed. One of the first things that happens is a plan, a deer population reduction. So we want to take something like this and go to this. And in many cases, deer herds are asked to be reduced below what those habitats can support. And there's not a hunter on the planet that wants to see this happen. Because nobody says, man, when I go hunting tomorrow, I hope I saw less deer than I did yesterday. That's crazy. That's just not in our DNA. However, as hunters, we need to understand why we need to start supporting this and why this is necessary just for the future of hunting. May not see as many deer next year or the year after, but by doing this is the only way to ensure that 5, 10, and 20 years down the road, we are going to continue to have very healthy deer populations that allow us to continue to hunt them. And with this, we know that by minimizing congregation of deer is one of the best ways that we can keep this disease from spreading. You know, the cattle version of this, the BSE, one of the neat things about cattle is if a cow has this, you can put it out to pasture with 1,000 other cattle and it cannot give the disease to any of them. And man, I wish that was the way in deer, but it's not. The version in deer is such that if a deer has it and it comes in contact with other deer, it can give it to those other deer. So this is why the Game Commission asks us to reduce these deer numbers, limit congregation of those deer, limit contact to help limit the spread of this disease. Once you get it, it's the end of deer season as you know it. Now we have things like CWD check stations where we were asked to provide samples. You end up going home with headless deer. And you know what? This is a punch in the gut to a lot of hunters. And part of it is because, you know, we like things to be very traditional, the way they were in the past. And I get it. I'm the same way. I grew up in a very traditional northern Pennsylvania deer camp. I'm very blessed to get to hunt out of that same camp today. So I know how it is. I know how hunters at my camp are. They want to have deer season start on the same day every year. You want to have the same members in camp to be able to celebrate with and hunt with. You want to go to that same spot hunting. I get it. So as soon as this shows up now, it changes that. Is it an inconvenience to have to provide samples and go to check stations? Absolutely. But you know what? It's an inconvenience that's well worth doing. If this is something that we have to do to help safeguard the future of deer hunting, then it's absolutely worth our time to do this. And it's worth it from two ways. One, if we're providing these samples, then the Game Commission can estimate prevalence of the disease in this area and the rate of spread. And then based on those two things, it allows them to attack it differently. From our end as hunters, by providing these samples, that's the only way to know if our deer is safe to eat or not. And we'll talk more about that later, but this may be a bit of an inconvenience, but it's absolutely something that's well worth it for us and for the future of our deer herds. Well, we also know that when the disease arrives, we end up with movement regulations. These are those high-risk parts that I talked about, longer hunting seasons, additional hunting seasons, sharpshooting. These are all in efforts to help reduce deer herds, not to zero. And we hear that, we see that on social media. People say, oh, the Game Commission, they're going to get rid of all the deer. They want to go to zero. Well, first of all, that's not true. That's not the goal. But even if it was, it is physically impossible for that to happen. If they set out and put a bounty on every single deer in an area, even then we would not be able, we as hunters could never reduce them all. So the cool thing is we are very blessed with numbers of deer that we have here, the productivity of our habitat. So even when we reduce these deer herds to the levels that the Game Commission is asking us to do, we still have very huntable populations of deer. Not all states in the country could say that. So we're very lucky from that perspective, and we need to embrace that from a hunting crowd. Once CWD arrives, there's a loss of privileges. No more feeding, no more baiting, no using minerals or urine attractants. And this is because we don't want deer congregated in these areas, swapping spit at mineral licks or eating from the exact same spot. We know that the disease can be transferred through urine, feces, saliva, blood, and boy, that saliva thing is a big one here. So that's why all of this goes out the window. So if you like to use corn or something to do a formal camera survey during the summer outside of the hunting season, that goes out the window. If you like to use some minerals to be able to photograph deer, that's gone. And I'll admit, this is a great way to get deer in front of the camera to be able to use salt or some trace minerals. However, it's important that we understand, why the Game Commission takes this part away from us. Saliva is a pretty good medium for the infectious materials to be able to move from one deer to another. So think about this, these mineral licks. Every single deer coming is licking from the same spot. So they're chewing the dirt or the minerals from the same spot. They're drinking water from that. They're swapping spit. Man, this is just a great way for one deer to give it to another. And I'll say this, I have a colleague in Missouri who has a great photo of a deer standing in a mineral lick, there's water in it, getting ready to take a drink. And it's a deer that is CWD positive. It actually is showing some of the symptoms, drooped ears, head is hanging down, and it is literally drooling into the mineral lick. The picture is at night, and there are 2 deer standing behind it. You can see the eye shine. 2 other deer waiting their turn to come get a drink and get some of those minerals that literally within seconds of the CWD positive deer dropping the saliva in there are going to be licking out of that. So that is the real danger of this. And this is why this stuff is not allowed, and for good reason it's not allowed. Well, also, when CWD arrives, mature bucks are not encouraged. So we want to go from something like this. And many states want to see us drive that age structure younger. The reason is, as Brian showed earlier, adult bucks are just far more likely to have it than younger bucks. And you know what? On paper, it makes sense. Let's drive age structure young for bucks. Let's drive age structure young for does. Let's reduce deer herds, and we can beat this disease. The reality of it is, though, hunters are needed to execute that plan, and hunters just have not been willing to do that, or at least not to do that to the intensive degree that's necessary to really slow this disease down. I said earlier, relative to more adult does out there than there are adult bucks. And in Pennsylvania here, you know, we have a good opportunity to really be able to help this with the number of deer that we shoot. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later, but suffice to say, we actually don't kill as many deer on a per hunter basis here as many other states, but it's something that we absolutely have to capitalize on if we're going to get ahead of this disease. Once the disease shows up, there's license money that gets diverted from herd and habitat management programs for things like CWD sampling, monitoring, surveillance. And take it as this, you know, CWD is extremely expensive. State of Wisconsin, their DNR has spent over $50 million on sampling and monitoring and surveillance for CWD. And, you know, then they had to do this. Good for them. This is not a bash on them by any means. This has given them a better idea of where it is and the rate of spread that many other states are now using that information to help improve the situation in their states. Now, they didn't want to spend all this on it, but it's a good thing they did. I'm glad that they did. However, if they didn't have this disease, think about what we could have done if instead they could have spent that money on hunter access programs, land purchases, habitat enhancement. Man, there are so many better things that we could have spent it on if they didn't have the disease. However, once the disease shows up, it necessitates that money be able to go to sample and monitor and surveillance, because otherwise it doesn't do us any good to have hunter access if we don't have deer out there to hunt in the future. We know the hunting participation rates can decline. I'm going to use Wisconsin again here because we have some great data from them. This is the last year before CWD was confirmed. This is the number of paid hunting license holders. That year, they killed some deer that tested positive. So the next year, way fewer hunters. 2003, yeah, they rebounded a little bit. But you know what? Over the next 10 years, the numbers never did get back to where they were pre-CWD. And some hunters may say, you know what? I don't see this as a bad thing. I don't want to be crowded when I'm hunting. And man, I get it. I don't want to be crowded when I'm hunting either. But for the future of hunting, this is not a good thing. And the reason for that is fewer hunters means less money for wildlife. Fewer hunters leads to less advocates for hunting. We talked earlier about the importance of healthy deer and deer populations because they fund so much of our wildlife management programs. There's nothing else out there to pick up the slack if we don't get this from deer hunters. So there's a whole bunch of other wildlife species all the way down the line that are going to suffer if we have less money for this. And think about this for the less advocates part of this. Do you know what percentage of the population hunts? Not many. You'll hear some people say it's my God-given right to hunt, and I'll always be able to do it. And you know what? I wish that was true, but that's not true. Only 4% of the U.S. population today, the U.S. adults, purchase a hunting license. And you know what? We don't get to do anything in this country because 4% of us want to do something. We get to hunt today because about 80% of the adult population supports hunting, supports legal, ethical, regulated hunting. So it's a good thing that we have a good public image because we have some pretty high support ratings today, record highs actually. However, by losing hunters, we have less advocates for this, and that is never a good thing for our future. There's also economic repercussions once the disease arrives. And this is because there's no way to decontaminate a CWD positive site, at least not with the science that we have now. We're learning more about this, and there's definitely some promise on the horizon here, but as of now, we can't. So what that means is that land values can decline, recreational land values anyway. When this arrived in Missouri, it was a 200 to 400 per acre loss in land value. That's a big hit. That's a lot of money per acre that you're losing simply because CWD has been confirmed in that area. We know too that no state has won the CWD battle. CWD prions remain in the soil for years. Brian shared the fact it's years, in some cases decades. Animals come into contact with them years or decades later, and they can still contract this disease. So, and that's one of the things that's allowing this disease to continue to spread through our deer herds. Well, Brian showed you these graphs, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about them. I have 3 different ones here from 3 different counties. You can see this is the south central part of Iowa County. And look at just the solid blue line. That's the adult males. Those that are 2.5 years of age and older. The graph also includes yearling males and adult and yearling females, but we'll just look at the adult males. Look at this. Back in 2002, only about 1% of the adult bucks in this area of south central Iowa County had the disease. Well, look what happened fast forward to 2014. 30% of their adult bucks had them. Look at that growth curve. That's not slowing down anytime soon. It's even worse in southeastern Richland County. 35% of their adult bucks had it. It's even worse in north central Iowa County. Over 45% of their bucks had it. Now, obviously, this is a terrible, terrible situation. But I'm showing you these graphs because here in Pennsylvania, we're still in the early years of this. However, the growth curves that we see right now mirror what they saw in Wisconsin. So what that lets us know is, without a shadow of a doubt, if we do nothing, or if we don't get intensive enough on this, this is exactly what we're going to see in Pennsylvania in a decade or so, where in this case, almost half of the bucks have the disease. The good thing is we recognize this now. Game Commission has a great plan in place. And as the more hunters learn about this, learn what we can do, we can keep this from happening. But it's going to take all of our hunting public to be able to work together to make this stop. So what are the implications for deer management then? Fewer mature bucks? Absolutely. If we stay on this growth curve, if you like to see mature bucks out there, that is going to go by the wayside. Lower deer densities? Absolutely. We're seeing population level impacts in other places, and the same thing will happen here. Fewer disease-free deer? Yeah. If you like to eat venison, I know I do. My family eats a bunch of venison every year. So suddenly this is not nearly the safe wild food that it's been in the past. So these are real implications. These are things that are going to happen if we don't take action. Let's talk about the eating part of this for a second. Is CWD positive venison safe to eat? Well, according to both the World Health Organization and the Centers for Disease Control, currently there is no evidence that humans can contract Creutzfeldt-Jakob, which is the human form of this disease, by eating CWD-infected deer. However, they still encourage you to not eat a deer that has the disease. At the National Deer Association, we strongly encourage you, if you hunt in a disease zone, to have that deer tested and do not eat that until you receive satisfactory results from that. And some will say, you know what, I've probably eaten CWD positive deer in the past. I don't care. I'm not going to get it tested. And you know what, if that's what you feel, then that's certainly you're right. However, I hope that you would then take that and feed that to some little boy or little girl in your house, or maybe your niece or nephew, or a little boy or little girl down the street, maybe that needy family that needs something, or give it to your church without having it being tested. This is a big deal. And you know, the thing here in the United States is that 1 in 7 households are food insecure. Think about that. 1 out of 7 houses don't have enough protein. Think about this from a hunting end. We are in a situation where there's additional deer that need to be harvested. We have the opportunity to do that, feed ourselves, and then feed others. This is a win-win-win situation. It's great for the deer herd and the future of deer, good for our public image, which helps maintain high approval ratings for hunting, and then it feeds people that need deer as well. So that's a really good spot. That's a great opportunity that we're in as hunters. However, if you're in a disease zone, let's not be unsafe about this. Let's get these deer tested. That helps the Game Commission do a better job managing the disease. And then also that allows us to know that, yeah, that venison is safe to eat. All right, let's talk about deer harvest here for a minute. We've talked a bunch about the science and kind of what it means to us as hunters, but let's just look really where Pennsylvania falls relative to the rest of the country with regard to deer hunting. And you know what, people pick on the Game Commission all the time, and they're always attacking them. I totally get it. I work in 20 to 30 different states a year, and there's always hunters attacking the state or the Wildlife Management Agency. However, let's just take a look at an apples to apples comparison on how Pennsylvania hunters fare relative to other hunters out there. So what we do at the Deer Association is we conduct an annual or publish an annual deer report where we survey every state wildlife agency and get numbers on bucks that were harvested, does that were harvested, age structure, and the like, and put this all together. This is the top 5 list from the 2019 season. That's because we published this in January of this year, and at that time, there was many 2020 hunting seasons still going on. So this was the most recent data that was available from all the states. It shows that Pennsylvania's in the top 3. Texas almost always kills the most deer, but they got a big state, a lot of deer hunters. But to make this a little fair comparison, we can look at this on a per square mile basis. And what we found here is Pennsylvania fares even better. Michigan's the only state in the country that harvests more bucks per square mile than we do. Well, let's talk about this from the antlerless side, because this is really where the rubber meets the road. You need to harvest the appropriate number of antlerless deer to keep these deer herds in balance with their habitat if you want to have a successful deer management program for a long time. Once disease shows up, you actually need to reduce them below what that habitat can support to ensure healthy deer far into the future. Well, we're number 2 on the top 5 list relative to antlerless harvest. And if we look at this on a per square mile basis, we're right there again. Now take a look at the top 4 states here: Delaware, Pennsylvania, Maryland, New Jersey. These are all right here in the mid-Atlantic region. We're in a real sweet spot of the country relative to deer herds. We have very productive habitat. We pump a lot of fawns into the system, which provides a lot of deer out there for us to be able to hunt. So look at this. We shoot over 5 antlerless deer per square mile. This is an extremely high harvest rate. Very few states, could ever withstand anywhere near the harvest rate that we do on the antlerless side. Yet, in many places, our deer herd is still growing. So what I'm sharing you with this here is to say this, we kill a lot of deer in Pennsylvania, absolutely. However, we need to shoot even more. And the thing is, we have the deer available on the landscape to do that. You may be surprised to find that only 41% of all the hunters in the United States each year shoot a single deer. Think about that. Less than half of the hunters kill one deer. Only 18% kill more than one. So less than 1 in 5 hunters today are going to shoot more than one deer this year. The numbers are even poorer than that in Pennsylvania. Only about 37% of our hunters shoot a single deer, and only 13 or 14% shoot more than one. Part of that is, even though we kill a lot of deer, it's because we have so many hunters. Pennsylvania has more hunters per square mile than any state in the country. However, we also have a lot of deer, and if we increased the number of deer that we shoot, take additional bucks and additional does, we would be doing an even better job from a disease management standpoint, and it's something that's absolutely critical for us to do to get ahead of this disease. And I'll end with this one then, as far as Pennsylvania's hunting season. Pennsylvania rocks. We are one of only 3 states in the country to shoot over 300,000 deer annually. Michigan is the only state that shoots more bucks than us on a per square mile basis, and they barely shoot more, literally 1/10 of a buck per square mile. For the 11th year in a row, over half of our antlered buck harvest was at least 2.5 years old. And in fact, it was the highest percentage ever recorded. This is great if you're not in a disease zone. That is awesome. If you're in a disease zone, this becomes problematic. And this is where we need to start reducing that age structure of those bucks simply because of the high prevalence rate that they had. From the antlerless side, we harvested over 5 antlerless deer per square mile. That again was number 2 in the country. But if you add our bucks and our does together, we shot almost 9 deer per square mile. There's not a single state in the country that shoots more deer per square mile than we do. So we lead that list. And you know what? We can shoot even more. And I certainly hope that our hunters will get on board with this and do that this year, because the more that we do and the additional deer that we're taking, it's just protecting this resource for the future and limiting the spread of the disease and making sure that we can have deer far down the road for us, our kids, and our grandkids to be able to hunt. So current status for CWD, man, there is much concern about the increased spread of this disease, both new states getting it and new areas within states that have it. However, there's also a lot of concern about the future of wildlife management, deer herds, deer hunting, and all wildlife management because of the importance of that funding from deer hunters, what that has on all of those other species. So this is much more than just a deer issue. So is this the end of deer hunting? Well, I'm an optimist. I'm going to say no, but we must be vigilant to minimize transmission in existing areas where we have the disease, prevent introduction of CWD into new areas where they don't have it, and support research so we can learn more about this disease and how to better battle it, and certainly support the Pennsylvania Game Commission's efforts with what they're doing. They have put together a tremendous CWD response plan, and here in a minute, Andrea Corman will be able to tell you what they are doing to safeguard this incredible resource that we have. But it's going to take hunters working with them, and as hunters, a lot of this is in our hands. There's something we can do every single day to help in this fight, and I certainly hope that you will join me in doing so. At the National Deer Association, we have this document, recommended practices for deer hunters. If you're hunting in a disease zone, talks about deer harvest, talks about habitat management, and then a bunch of other things. This is a free download. You're welcome to go and grab it. And with that, my email address is on here. We'll do a Q&A when we get done, but if there's anything that I can do after tonight relative to answering questions or helping out anything disease or deer or habitat related, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm glad to do that. And with that, Matt, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Kip. Excellent job. Next up, we have Andrea Corman, the CWD coordinator with the Pennsylvania Game Commission, to give a presentation on what the PGC is doing about chronic wasting disease across the state. Andrea, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, Matt. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen here. Okay, can you see it all right?
I can, it looks great.
Okay, thanks. All right, so good evening, everybody. So to start us off, I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of CWD in Pennsylvania. So CWD surveillance in Pennsylvania has been ongoing since 1998. And as of today, over 107,000 deer and nearly 1,600 elk have been tested. In 2003, the first Pennsylvania Interagency CWD response plan was developed by agencies like the Game Commission, Pennsylvania Department of Ag, USDA, and many others. This was also the beginning of our statewide sampling, where previously only clinical suspects were tested for CWD. Then in 2006, authority over the captive cervid industry was actually transferred from the Game Commission to Pennsylvania Department of Ag. So in Pennsylvania, CWD is managed under two different agencies, which can be challenging. And in 2012, we had our first detections of CWD in Pennsylvania. Then in July of last year, our agency response plan was approved by the Board of Commissioners, and we began implementing it that fall. Now, going back to our first detections, in October 2012, CWD was detected in a captive facility, which is represented by a yellow star on the map that was in Adams County. And so that resulted in the creation of Disease Management Area, or DMA 1. And that facility was depopulated. 2 months later, 3 hunter-harvested free-ranging deer, represented by the red dots on the map, tested positive in Blair and Bedford counties, which resulted in the establishment of DMA 2. Now, given the distance, these events are not necessarily related, so it's hard to say exactly how CWD got into Pennsylvania. Now, DMA 3 was created in 2014 after CWD was detected in 2 captive facilities in Jefferson County. Then DMA 1 was dissolved in 2017 after going 5 consecutive years without any additional CWD detections. Then in 2018, DMA 4 was created after CWD was detected in a captive cervid facility in Lancaster County. Now within DMAs, there is a ban on removing high-risk parts, feeding deer, and using urine-based attractants. Even with restrictions in place and increased surveillance, DMAs have continued to expand and more deer test positive each year. If the trajectory of the disease increases in Pennsylvania like it has in other states, the infection rate in portions of Blair, Bedford, and Fulton counties will likely exceed 30% in the next 10 to 20 years and will continue to spread throughout the state. The revised and updated response plan establishes a framework for managing CWD in Pennsylvania. So currently, best management strategy to control CWD is to reduce deer abundance in infected areas, to slow the rate of disease transmission, and remove infected individuals from the landscape. So many of the strategies in the plan focus on ways to limit spread of the disease and prevent it from becoming established in new areas. So the response plan identifies 4 different types of management areas. So we've got our disease management areas, or DMAs, the established area, enhanced surveillance units, and containment zones. And each of those is associated with different objectives and strategies. So first we have our DMAs, and these are our current DMA boundaries. And a DMA is created when new CWD detections are found in either free-ranging or captive deer, regardless of proximity to any previous detections. A 10-mile buffer is placed around each detection, and 10 miles is used because it encompasses the dispersal distances of most deer in Pennsylvania and also includes the area where that positive deer may have been spreading prions. And depending on the location of the detection, it might have no effect. It could result in the expansion of an existing DMA, or it could even cause a new DMA to be created. So the purpose of a DMA is to reduce the human-assisted spread of CWD. Sampling is also increased to detect CWD spread from known locations. So feeding deer is prohibited, along with the use of natural urine-based attractants. Both can cause increased congregation of deer and can therefore increase transmission of the disease. High-risk parts cannot be taken outside the DMA, and I'll define high-risk parts more later, but generally we're talking about the brain and the spinal column. We also increased antlerless allocations in wildlife management units that have had CWD detections to reduce deer abundance and limit spread of the disease. And head collection bins are also provided for hunters to submit deer heads for testing to help us increase sampling and surveillance. Now for the established area, we currently only have one, and it's found within DMA2. And an established area is characterized by CWD detections that occur contiguously across a large area and consistently from year to year. Now, in an established area, CWD is considered established within the deer population, and coupled with environmental contamination, poses a long-term threat to neighboring areas. And this area covers primarily Blair, Bedford, and Fulton counties, or in terms of wildlife management units, that would be 4A and a small portion of 2C. And over 90% of our positives have come from this area. In an established area, the extent of CWD infection is more significant than in other areas. So the goal is to maintain sample prevalence at or below 5% and minimize the movement of high-risk parts to other areas. So that 5% was chosen because data from other states and models show once this threshold is crossed, disease prevalence accelerates drastically, making management of the disease even more difficult. To reach this goal, reducing deer abundance is the primary management strategy in this area, and this is done through increased hunter harvest and helps reduce the potential for disease transmission and also removes additional positive deer from the landscape. Due to the degree of infection in this area, transport of high-risk parts outside of the established area is prohibited. That is a new regulation for this year. Other DMA restrictions also apply, so there's no feeding deer and there's no using natural urine-based attractants in the established area either. Now, I mentioned the goal of 5% or less for sample prevalence in the established area, and based on hunter-harvested adult deer, our sample prevalence in the established area has been above 5% since the 2018 season and is now actually close to 14%. So it's clear there is a significant problem in the established area. Next, we have enhanced surveillance units. So these are individual areas within DMAs that are created when there is a new CWD detection in, again, either a free-ranging or captive deer that is greater than 5 miles from any other past detection. And an enhanced surveillance unit is created by using an approximately 3 to 5 mile radius buffer around an isolated detection. So this buffer was chosen to balance the need to focus surveillance efforts in the area where an infected deer was likely to have traveled and still be able to collect enough samples to meet the target sample size. So in these new areas, the extent and sample prevalence of CWD are unknown. And each enhanced surveillance unit has an associated DMAP unit. So to the public, this will look and function just like any other DMAP unit. And I know Justin showed the 6 in DMA2 earlier, but these are the 8 total that we created last year. So the purpose of an ESU is to determine the extent and sample prevalence of CWD through increased sampling. This is primarily achieved through increased hunter harvest, and the target sample size for each unit is approximately 250 to 300 deer to give us an adequate confidence that we would detect the disease if it is in a small percentage of the population within that unit. And hunters can also purchase up to 2 additional antlerless tags per unit to help meet those sample goals. Last year, hunter participation was relatively good, with all but 1 unit selling at least 50% or more of available permits. We also exceeded our target sample size in 4 of those units. And in the units where we did not reach the 250 samples, we still received really good numbers, and the samples from those units will still be informative. And last but not least, we have our containment zones. So these are the smallest geographic areas consisting of an approximately 1 mile radius buffer around the location of a new CWD detection. And the size is based on a deer's average home range. And so that includes the individuals it was most likely to come in contact with and potentially infect. So this area represents our best option to suppress the impact of an initial CWD detection. And this is just an example map with a hypothetical enhanced surveillance unit and containment zone, so you can see just how small a containment zone really is. And the purpose of a containment zone is to prevent the establishment and spread of CWD by removing the most high-risk deer from the area immediately surrounding a CWD detection. Management strategies in these areas can include increased hunter harvest and targeted removals to ensure deer most likely to have come in contact with the positive detection are removed. Now, given the small scale of these areas, communication and outreach to landowners for hunting access also occurs as a regular part of this process. And targeted removals do not occur unless we have permission from the landowner. Now, moving on to some of our other management strategies, we already know it's unlawful to remove or export high-risk cervid parts from a DMA or the established area. It is also unlawful to import these parts from any state or province outside Pennsylvania. That is also a new regulation this year. So high-risk parts include the head, but more specifically, the brain, eyes, lymph nodes, and tonsils, along with the spinal cord and the spleen. So these parts are considered high risk because prions concentrate in high densities in those locations. And the importance of these regulations is to prevent people from dumping high-risk parts on the landscape in uninfected areas, possibly contaminating the soil in that area or exposing healthy deer or elk to the disease. Now, I've mentioned reducing deer numbers to slow the rate of disease transmission and to remove diseased individuals from the landscape. So how exactly do we go about doing that? The best way is to increase hunter harvest, and then in very specific situations, use targeted removals. We can and have increased hunter harvest in several ways. So we can increase antlerless harvest at the wildlife management unit scale through antlerless license allocations, or even at a smaller scale using those DMAP permits in the enhanced surveillance units. Concurrent firearm seasons also give hunters more flexibility to use those opportunities. And successful management of CWD cannot occur without hunters. Their cooperation is essential, and removing those barriers to participation, like limited time to hunt, is one way to do this. Now, targeted removals are an option, like I said, in certain areas with specific objectives. So again, these are very small-scale operations carried out by wildlife professionals from USDA Wildlife Services, and they only occur post-hunting season. And these efforts are heavily dependent on landowner participation, since removals only occur on properties where access has been permitted. Our surveillance efforts are also critical in detecting new cases of CWD and tracking the spread and sample prevalence of the disease. So in addition to testing white-tailed deer, we do test elk as well, and nearly all hunter harvested elk are tested, along with roadkill and clinical suspect elk. And to date, no elk has tested positive, and no deer from within the elk management area have tested positive. But we have had over 700 CWD positive deer since it was initially detected in 2012. So for deer, we collect samples through a variety of methods, and Justin had kind of mentioned some of these earlier, but this includes hunter harvest from voluntary samples from head collection bins, which are only located within DMAs, as well as hunter harvest samples that are collected from meat processors statewide. Contractors are also employed to collect roadkill deer from state and local roads within and around the perimeter of DMAs. And those are probably our most important samples because they are often the first indication that the disease is expanding into new areas. And clinical suspects are also collected statewide. To help the public stay current with our sampling efforts, we have a new dashboard that you can access from our main CWD page under CWD test results and surveillance data. So it allows you to see our most up-to-date sampling data and consists of 3 pages. So there's samples over time, sample prevalence, and sample statistics. And the sample prevalence page you see here contains a series of filters and maps to provide information at different scales. We're also actually working with Department of Ag to develop one showing information for the captive industry, and that should be available to the public relatively soon. And as part of the Game Commission's efforts to effectively manage CWD and other wildlife diseases, the Wildlife Futures program was started in 2019. And Wildlife Futures is a partnership between the Game Commission and the University of Pennsylvania's School of Veterinary Medicine. And this program combines wildlife disease expertise and research from Penn Vet with the Game Commission's commitment to protecting, managing, and promoting wildlife in Pennsylvania. So Wildlife Futures has a CWD diagnostic lab that provides 2 types of testing, including a more rapid test that has helped us improve turnaround times. So in other words, we can notify a hunter of their deer's test results within days rather than weeks. Now, some of the CWD research that they're doing includes work to develop a rapid field test for CWD using biomarkers from infected deer, and also development of procedures where dogs are actually trained to detect CWD in deer feces. For more information on their research and other services, you can visit the Wildlife Futures website at this link. And we actually also have this phone number and email that are available for the public to use for any CWD related questions. So that's all I have, and thank you all very much. And Matt, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you very much, Andrea. That concludes the formal presentation section of this evening. Next, we're going to move to the Q&A session. And actually, we've had several populate in that. If you have a question, now would be a good time to write that in. We also had one emailed earlier, and I can see that Justin has actually already responded to one that was written into the Q&A. So some of these, I'm going to go through these one by one, and I may address a specific speaker to start or the entire panel. We actually had an email sent earlier today, and the question goes, if CWD is such a problem, why do we not find carcasses or bones, et cetera, in the woods when hunting? And the second part of that is talking about the prevalence. Person says, if my math is correct, about 1.8% of the deer tested were positive. So if we kill 100 deer, for example, to lower the deer herd in a certain area, only 2 of the 100 have the disease. That does not seem very efficient or prevalent to me. So for the first question, why do we not find carcasses or bones in the woods when hunting? I'll just address that to the entire panel. Who would like to answer that first?
I'll start with that, Matt, and then others can join in if they want. The reason for that is deer can carry this disease for 18 to 24 months on average before they start showing any of those symptoms. So it's very rare for a deer to make it all the way to the end of that and actually waste away for us to find it. It does happen, and people see it. And actually, we have an article on our website about a hunter in Mississippi that watched a deer die right in front of him that tested positive for it. But they normally will die to something else first, to a predator, to a car, to a hunter or whatever. So that's why typically we don't see many. They're just so predisposed to dying that it's very rare for them to make it to the end of that whole disease cycle and actually waste away, and then for us to find a pile of bones. Doesn't make it any less deadly to deer or any less impactful to that deer population. But that's why we typically don't see any or see very few of those deer laying around. And any of the other panelists can add to that if they'd like.
Okay, why don't we move on to the second part about the prevalent rate, talking about 2% or 1.8%. I know Brian and Andrea both showed different statistics that in certain regions it's higher than that. Brian, would you mind commenting on prevalence and that point?
I can take a stab at it. Be glad to. Yeah, overall, your number or your percent positive tests was a little less than 2%, but in your core area, as I recall, it's something in the 12, 13, 14% range. I suppose if you thought it was going to stay there, that'd be one thing. But experience, data, science suggests that prevalence increases at an exponential rate over time. And so it's not going to stay at that low level. So when's the right time to manage? Probably before you have disease and as early as you detect disease. So yeah, you're right. If you, on average, you've got 2 positive animals out of 100, that means 98 out of 100 don't have it yet. So management, there's nothing about it that's simple. And if we had better tools or better able to target those positives, again, focusing our harvest in areas where prevalence is higher, focusing on the groups that are much more likely to have disease, and creating opportunities for hunters, landowners that want to participate. Those are the things that can be done, and focusing on those positive cohorts.
Thanks, Brian.
Hey, Matt, I'm going to add one thing to that too. It's not always a bad thing to, as you're sampling, to not find the disease. Whether the prevalence rate in that area is 2% or 10% is very different, and it's a very different strategy than the Game Commission is going to employ with that. So just because we're not finding CWD positive deer through those samples doesn't necessarily mean that that's bad. In many cases, that's good. But even with that, it gives us a good idea of how prevalent the disease is right now, and then maybe how much time we have before we start seeing some of those big increases. But all those samples are good. So a CWD not detected sample is not necessarily a bad thing by any means.
Thanks,
And
Skip.
just to even add a tiny bit to that,
Sure.
that 1.8 to 2% that you're talking about is a statewide number, and CWD just is not, fortunately, a statewide disease in Pennsylvania. It's not evenly distributed, and that's not how we manage it. So when we talk about prevalence from the agency, we're mostly looking at our established area, and that is where it is about 14%. And so that's something you have to take into consideration. If you're getting that number off of our dashboard, that is a statewide number, but that's not the number that we use for management with the agency.
Good point, Andrea. Okay, next question. Deer farms have been a substantial reason for positive cases. Why are they not closed?
Well, in Pennsylvania, the deer farm industry is not managed by the Game Commission. That actually falls to Pennsylvania Department of Ag. And they do recognize that, deer farms do have CWD. The movement of deer can cause the spread of the disease, and they are, trying to take actions to help minimize that. Just this last year, they created the Core Captive Management Zone, which is similar to our established area, and it has implemented restrictions on those facilities in terms of movements and standards for sampling. So even though we still have facilities, PDA is trying to at least do something to help minimize that risk.
Thank you, Andrea.
I can add a little bit to that, Matt. I mean, the basic reason why deer farms exist is because they're a lawful activity in at least some of the states. There's quite a few states that are never enabled captive, cervid farming. Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Texas, Ohio, a number of other states have. And so it's a decision that the legislatures in those states have consciously made to enable that activity. So, and so the question is, deer farms are a portion of, the movement of CWD. Undoubtedly they are, but I'll also offer up, they're not the only, issue going on with CWD. And so even if one thought that, deer farms are absolutely a culprit, I couldn't agree with that based on the science. They're a part of the equation. But even if you could wave a magic wand, make all deer farms go away, it doesn't make CWD go away. So there's a lot more to it. As Andrea identified, you got prevalence, population level prevalence right now, pushing, plus 10%, 14% range in your core area. It's increasing at an exponential rate. And deer farms are not really a portion of that exponential growth rate in the wild in your core area right now. So yeah, it's part of the situation, but making them go away is not the solution.
Certainly very complicated. Thanks, Brian. This next question says, why wouldn't predators take care of the diseased animals? Somebody want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, I can take a stab at that. Yeah, the peer-reviewed literature suggests that in areas with large predators, especially mountain lions, they do preferentially harvest CWD positive animals. Studies in both Wyoming, observations in Colorado have shown that. Again, recall that CWD is a progressive neurological disorder. So these deer, when prion deposition begins in the central nervous system, they start going downhill. They're less aware of their surroundings. So they're more vulnerable to predators. They're more vulnerable to predators that begin with Buick and things like that, and likely to hunters as well. So yes, in areas where there's large predators, they can take out CWD positive animals. Now, from the perspective of whether that can make a difference at the population level, remember again, that progressive neurological degeneration, that begins once prion deposition begins in the central nervous system. And that's vastly far after the time that animals start shedding infectious agent out into the environment and can infect other animals. So by the time a predator can leverage that progressing neurological degeneration, that animal's had months to be able to actively transmit CWD to other animals and to shed infectious agent out into the wild. So predators, great thing, but by themselves, they're no match for this disease in an established area.
Thanks, Brian. Okay, I'm going to read one of the questions that was then answered by Justin. Where can people find CWD check stations and how do they work? And Justin wrote, Pennsylvania doesn't have check stations for CWD. To get a deer tested, you can 1, put the head in one of those head bins that he had mentioned, 2, send it direct to the lab at your own cost, or 3, take it to a processor where it might be collected as part of the random sample. And he provided a link, locations of head bins and processors and taxidermists that cooperate with PGC. Justin, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, the only thing I can say is that we update that list annually as we add additional cooperating processors and taxidermists, or move head bins around or add them on the landscape. And we will be finalizing those lists in August and September, and they'll be available before the early archery season starts.
Thanks, Justin.
Justin, did you provide the PDF or the link to the interactive map?
I just provided a link to the CWD page because the
Okay.
List of sites isn't available yet.
Okay, we do also have, there's a PDF version with the listed information and the addresses. We also have an interactive map people can use. You can zoom into your, hunting location or wherever you live, and it'll tell you if there's a head bin there as well. So it's kind of 2 different places you can look.
Right,
Thank you, Andrea.
You can access that from smartphones and from the computer. If you just search for "where can I take my deer," and on the website, it'll take you to that map.
Perfect. Andrea, this is a good one for you. Does PA have see a difference between the CWD positive deer sampled via roadkill versus harvested deer? It was mentioned that the DMA was expanded due to roadkill. How often does that happen? So it's kind of a 2-parter.
Multi-part.
Yeah.
So we kind of talked about this throughout, Brian's talk, and in even one of the earlier questions that, CWD positive deer are more susceptible to other types of mortality. And so what we can see in roadkill is sometimes an artificially inflated prevalence. And so that's a big part of why we try to use adult hunter harvested deer when we're looking at prevalence in the established area. It's a little bit more representative of what's happening in the overall population there. But on the other hand, roadkill are just as important in our surveillance efforts. Like the question says, how often do roadkill cause, DMA expansions? It's been fairly often. They tend to, we pick them up on the outskirts of the DMAs, and we're able to, kind of track the spread of the disease that way. And if we didn't collect those samples, then we might be a little too late, finding it in certain areas.
I can add a wee little bit to that. Seeing the question, I did run some numbers. Just looking at the Southcentral Region's sampling over the last year, about 3.9% of hunter harvest deer were positive and only 3.2% of roadkills. If you look at the literature going back a number of years, especially from the Western United States, we find that roadkill deer have a much higher prevalence than deer that die from other causes. And we're not finding that to be the case in Pennsylvania, especially in the established area, I should say. And that's because hunters basically have access to every acre in Pennsylvania. So they're able to exploit the entire deer population, even if the roadkill sample is more of a random sample.
Thank you, Justin. Okay, I got a question here on testing. Are there any plans to develop or use a CWD rapid or field test, such as the test named MN Quick, developed in Minnesota? And the second part says the goal allowing hunters to continue to hunt versus using a tag, and the season may be over before results are received. So I know there was a mention of rapid test development on Andrea's slide. It was a mention of Penn Vet. So either Eric or Andrea can comment about Pennsylvania specific. And then if Brian wants to, we can talk a little bit more about the national efforts on rapid testing after they speak. So Eric or Andrea, either one want to take that first? What's going on in PA?
Eric, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. Yeah, so we are working at Penn Vet to, implement all new diagnostics as quickly and effectively as possible, as well as have ongoing research projects to develop new, more rapid diagnostics tests. So I think Brian maybe can talk a little bit more about it specifically, but that MN quick test, while it is potentially a little bit faster, it's not sort of that real quick turnaround. So quick is an acronym there that actually is the type of test which stands for quaking induced conversion. So unfortunately not the time. So that test still requires specific equipment and training. And while it's a little bit more mobile than some of the previous tests, it's sort of not that, test your own deer yet, which of course would be the optimal goal. And with the Wildlife Futures Program, we have reduced our turnaround time for hunter sampling. I believe the average now is down to 9-day turnaround time. And again, a lot of the time involved kind of goes with the time it takes just to coordinate getting the samples into the bins, out of the bins, travel across the state. So hopefully we'll be more quickly, but that is something we're fully engaged in and we'll be bringing to Pennsylvania as soon as it's possible.
Thanks, Eric. Brian, do you want to comment about testing, kind of new research?
Yeah, I'd be glad to. I mean, that question was regarding a test that some Minnesota researchers have kind of tweaked another assay that was referred to as RT Quick. They're calling it, possibly a field test, but it's not what I would consider a field test. Again, that hunters can't do it themselves. What they've done is tweaked an assay, then this piece of equipment theoretically could be placed at, check stations, regional offices, or, other facilities where hunters could then, bring their deer into that centralized location and the testing could be accommodated at that station. But again, that would take a pretty significant investment in equipment, likely clean spaces, controlled clean spaces to run the assays, trained technicians to be able to, to run the tests. And I think they're talking a turnaround time of something like 24 hours. So existing technologies like ELISA could be done realistically in that same time frame if you distributed the technology and the people out to remote locations. As Eric identified, it's logistics. It's getting the head out of the bin. It's getting the tissue sample out of the head. It's getting the tissue to the lab. And then at the back end, getting the data, entered into, data systems and results back to the individual hunter. That's what takes the time. An ELISA test by itself takes 2-3 hours to run on an individual sample. So it's all the other things that add up into that, turnaround time. And I agree, it would be fantastic and really meaningful if hunters could get test results back, in a couple hours or a couple days. But we need to figure out how to cut down on those logistics. And so recall, Pennsylvania last year tested over 12,000 animals. So it would be a pretty remarkable feat if Pennsylvania Futures could turn each and every one of them around in less than a day, including all the logistics. Then I think your price per individual test would start soaring if you were trying to do that. So 8-9 day turnaround, overall, really, really good from a national perspective. You're right in there with the absolute leaders with regard to turning it around. And unfortunately, the technology to really put this, like an early pregnancy test sort of a thing into hunters' hands is a long ways off, unfortunately.
Thanks, Brian. All right, the gentleman asked actually kind of two questions, so I'm going to read them both. Can plants draw prions into their leaves when growing, along with other minerals and water? And then theoretically, could a deer eat those and get CWD? And then there's a food plot related question. Are food plots small enough to congregate deer to make them more likely to spread CWD? So I'll pick on Kip. Kip, do you mind answering those? Let me read them again. Can plants draw on prions into their leaves when growing, along with minerals and water?
Yeah, and the answer to that is yes. And there's research that shows that those prions are in the soil there. Plants can actually uptake those, bring them up through the plant and have them out into their leaves. The second part of that is a little less known on whether deer eating those can then contract the disease or not. Certainly we know they can get those prions through the leaves, but we haven't actually shown deer contract the disease by doing that, although it seems like it's a possible route anyway. The second part of that, the food plot part, well, that's really going to depend on deer density in the area and size of that food plot. I've been on some pretty big food plots in low density areas where deer were much congregated at all, not any more than they were in an oak forest where they were in there eating on acorns. Been in other areas where they had very tiny hunting plots, maybe an eighth of an acre, and I've seen 10 or 15 deer on that plot. So in those cases, yeah, they certainly can. So it's not kind of an all or nothing type thing. Food plots are certainly better than a feed station or a bait station because they can spread deer out some, and until that food is eaten to the ground, deer are not eating off the ground. They're eating that vegetation that's up above the ground, which is much better, a much healthier situation. But just like under a wild apple tree, an oak, beech nut, or anything else, food plots can congregate deer if there's limited food available around that area, or certainly limited preferred food like is in that food plot.
All right, thanks, Kip. We got 4 questions left, so I'm going to try to get through those. We can kind of do a rapid fire to be done by 9 p.m. Eastern if we can, or around there. This one's for Andrea or Justin. As a landowner in the surveillance area, there are many does on my property than the forested habitat can support. Can a landowner request a targeted removal to address the problem? CWD risk could be reduced and forest regeneration could be enhanced. So is that something a landowner can request?
Go ahead.
I would start by advising the landowner to contact the region office where their property is located, and they can enroll you in our Deer Management Assistance Program. This is a program free to landowners, enables them to enroll portions or all of their property to assist with crop depredation, forest regeneration issues, even specific deer management desires. And we will work with you to enable hunters to take those deer first. The cost of the program is borne by hunters. They pay for the antlerless license that they're given, or a coupon rather, that they redeem for a license. Each hunter is permitted to take 2 deer per unit, and we'd be happy to assist with that. I'll let Andrea answer the targeted removal question.
So that more so depends on, I guess, the type of property you have. We do have the red tag program available that does allow USDA to come out to your property and take those deer, but that is more so for crop depredation. So if you do have a crop field that is being damaged by deer, then you can certainly contact us and potentially participate in the red tag program.
Thanks, Andrea. We have a question here. Has Dr. Frank Bastian's research had any confirmation by other researchers yet? I'll say that was research that had a theory that the CWD was caused by a bacteria, not a prion, and nobody has duplicated or proven that. Does anybody want to elaborate on that? No. Okay, let's move on to the next one. Why doesn't Pennsylvania eliminate antler restrictions in CWD zones to reduce that age structure?
So we did look at that as a management option because other states have referenced that as a management option that might work for them. Our current antlered harvest is actually at or above what those other states are trying to get to. So we are already harvesting that many antlered deer that didn't seem like a necessary management strategy for us. For us, what's going to work better is increasing antlerless harvest. We have such a productive deer population that in order to get, kind of that social distancing that you need to reduce transmission, we need to harvest more antlerless deer. Would be more beneficial to us than removing the antler point restrictions.
Thanks, Andrea. We have a deer processor question. Is there any theory that basically CWD in the meat can resist protein breakdown, making some products like bologna? So does the prions in the meat cause some kind of different material or consistency in the meat? Has anybody ever heard anything or read anything about that?
I'm not aware of anything in the scientific literature that addresses that particular question. And yeah, this is the first time in 20 years I've seen that question. So I'm not aware of anything. So.
Okay. If we can't remove CWD from the environment and it lives in the soil, how do we keep it out of the deer once management is complete? Kind of a big question to end with.
Well, for Pennsylvania, in our response plan and everything we tell the public, this is essentially a lifelong management until there is some kind of cure or vaccine or something, which is not, to my knowledge, on the near horizon. This is something that we are trying to manage the spread of and keep it from getting out of control. This is not something at this point, especially in the established area, that we can completely eliminate.
Okay, that's it for questions. Again, I mentioned earlier, this was recorded. So if you would like to go back and look at it, the National Deer Association has been posting the videos pretty quickly within a day or so on our YouTube channel. So you can go to deerassociation.com and click on our YouTube link or just subscribe to that. And all the other 5 and then tonight's will be on there in one series. So you can go back and watch those and they will be publicized as well. I want to take time to thank the panel, Eric for attending and being available for answering, but also for all 4 speakers, for Justin, Brian, Kip, and Andrea. Excellent job. And thanks very much to the attendees for spending some time with us tonight to listen about and ask questions regarding chronic wasting disease in the Commonwealth. So this concludes our 6-part series. We really appreciate all of the sponsors' help with this, and I hope everybody has a good evening and a safe and successful season if you're a deer hunter and you get out this fall. So thank you very much. Good night.
Everybody.